This is Hot Stacks. It's sponsored by Algolia and StackShare. I'm Alex. I'm from Algolia. I'm our community dev events manager. And basically what Algolia does, if you don't know, we're a hosted search API with the hopes of bringing beautiful, fast, and relevant search to the masses. So that's about it. Jonas will be moderating from StackShare, and I'll have him give you a little spiel about what they do and what they love.
All right. Thank you, Alex. My name is Jonas Bouchard, founder and CEO of StackShare. So we are on a mission to connect every developer in the world with the best tools and the companies using them. So if you're trying to compare tools, if you're trying to see what companies are using, come to StackShare and you will find what you're looking for. And if not, then it probably doesn't exist. So thank you all for coming. We have an amazing panel today. I'll let everyone introduce themselves, but we've got some amazing companies represented here today: Twilio, Optimizely, Kickbox, and NodeSource. So let's welcome our panelists. All right, so we are all here today because of this thing called GDPR. And before we get into GDPR, could everyone just briefly introduce themselves and what you do at your company?
Hello? Okay, we're good. Cool, so I'm Chris. I am a senior engineer at NodeSource. I have a hoodie, so you know it's legit. And I lead the infrastructure team, so we build things that our other developers then use to build things that we then sell. So I think I'm probably here to answer more technical and SRE type questions, but I'll do my best with the GDPR stuff as well.
Hi, does that work? Hey. I'm Peter Shafton, VP of Architecture at Twilio. As of June, it'll be 7 years for me at Twilio, so I am an engineer through and through. I do manage a few people, about 4 at Twilio, but fundamentally I've worked on the platform infrastructure, the voice infrastructure, orchestration, data platform, and I was the one who spearheaded GDPR at Twilio, so I know the plan of what we did and why we did it.
Hi, I'm Joy. I'm the Director of DevOps at Optimizely. What that actually means is that I kind of am responsible for our quality, reliability, developer productivity, and performance programs. I'm sort of been involved in GDPR tangentially and also highly, highly involved in stacks and site reliability through my career.
Peter gave it to me. Hi, everyone. My name is Lance Stone. I'm actually not an engineer, so I am super, super honored to be around so many smart people today. I'm a senior compliance analyst with Kickbox and the lead for our GDPR compliance readiness program. And I've gotten to partner with a very special gentleman named Dennis Damon, who is the CPO of ReturnPath, very, very well known in the privacy sphere. So I've been asked to speak here today mostly about GDPR, but I brought some engineering tidbits from our team as well. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. So also some more background here. Could we briefly go through everyone's tech stacks at your company? I can guess NodeSource. And let's keep it to web. I know that there's some pretty large companies here. Maybe just dominant web stack.
So we write a lot of things in Node. It would be a little weird if we didn't. Interestingly, actually, my little group doing infrastructure, we write almost nothing in Node. We use Python and some Go for a lot of the back-end stuff. Everything is on AWS. We use the standard AWS services that you would have heard of. Store things in S3, use RDS for databases, use a lot of EC2 and ECS, maybe a few other things as well, but that's most of it.
Oh, hey, there we go. So our web stack is not a huge portion of what we do, but we are an EC2 as well, AWS. We used to be a PHP shop on the front end. We are now predominantly Scala, Java, Node as well. a lot of MySQL infrastructure, some Redis. We use a little bit of everything to some degree, and then a lot of Java on the back end.
So Optimizely's front end is primarily a monolithic app for historical reasons. It's actually an old school Google app engine. It's Python on the back end, a lot of Java or JavaScript on the front end. And then, yeah, I'm not going to really talk too much about the rest of the stack, but we also have some Heroku, and we've got a good amount of AWS sprinkled in for the back end event logging pipeline.
So Kickbox is a SaaS email verification platform, so we like to keep it really simple. It's Node.js for the app itself, and for the web servers, we use AngularJS on the front end, which makes sense, right? And Redis and MySQL for our databases, and then everything is just hosted, the entire platform, all customer data hosted in AWS. We utilize them and leverage them obviously for convenience, but also their extensive security and ease of use.
All right. Cool. So now, one of the reasons why we're here, we're also going to talk about site reliability. GDPR. By the way, Algolia has created a very awesome search for GDPR, gdpr.algolia.com, if you want to actually search the text of it for some reason. Otherwise, we're going to explain what GDPR is. So could we just go through briefly, and everyone in your own words, describe what GDPR is for the audience here, for developers that are just wondering what this thing is that they keep getting emails about. I literally got one today from MailChimp that didn't explain what it is. So could you just say what GDPR is and why developers should care?
So I probably have the worst answer out of the four of us for this, because the way that NodeSource is structured right now, it's not actually a major concern for us directly, but it is essentially a thing that is about to become actual law, where consumers are going to be able to essentially have more control over their personally identifiable information as it gets stored online by companies that they use, and that there has to be, as a result, better understandings of where everyone's information is. And like, if I go, okay, I want you to erase, if I go to Facebook and write delete my account, like, does everything actually get deleted, or is there still something there? Like, things like that need to be addressed, and that's what the legal structure coming is supposed to enforce.
Yeah, so, I mean, not a lot of details to it, but it's the General Data Protection Regulation goes into effect May 25th, 26th? 25th, thank you. It's supposed to cover European citizens, but obviously has a big impact on American citizens. Gives you control over your data, the right to be forgotten. It talks about how companies handle that data. Is it encrypted at rest? Where does it go? Do we have the right to use your data for processing purposes? Can we analyze your data to do other things? Gives you the right and control over that as well. So it's really around controls, audit, breach notification, so that if your data does get stolen or our systems get breached, within 7 days we have to notify everybody that's happened. You can't wait a year and tell us later that a year ago your data was stolen. So a lot of it's process related, and a lot of it's technical related, to that we're protecting it in the best way we can, and not doing something we didn't tell you we were going to do with the data.
Yeah, so not going to get into it too much more deeply than that. I think that actually we have a ringer right here who's going to explain probably wonderfully about the law. I really do think that it's a really interesting stance for the EU, that, saying, like, as a consumer, that you own your data. You have not just the right to be forgotten, but you have the right to know what someone is collecting for you. And you also do have the right to be notified in a timely manner if someone else has gotten that data in a way that you haven't explicitly said is okay. So that's really cool. For Optimizely, it's important because we have a large stack. Like, we process a lot of click data and things for customers. We may or may not have, like, more detailed information per person, but obviously we're a business-to-business company, so we actually have to think really carefully about how we are storing data and how we are giving people the ability to retrieve their data.
Mine will read a little bit more like a love story. So GDPR is, feedback It's a European privacy regulation, and it's the most significant data privacy law that has ever come about on planet Earth. So we've had previous frameworks before, the PECR, which is sort of a governance over electronic communications for Europe, already existed. We've had CASTLE, which governs, Canada. And we've had similar, frameworks, which I shall not bore you with, but essentially GDPR is like a whole new frontier and a departure from some of the lackadaisical data protection regulations beforehand. Specifically with Europe, there was an EC decision in 95. There was the 95 directive. There was the Data Protection Act of 1998. And in 2010, the EC released an updated version of their model clauses. So GDPR is really the continuation of this long-standing tradition of Europe to try to protect their citizens' private data from all kinds of companies and access. So it's the latest version of that. The implications that it has for tech companies is astounding because as tech companies, we are collecting data in the course of providing our services and products, perhaps more so than other industries like retail and product-based services where you're selling a physical product. For example, if you're selling widgets or yo-yos, you might have a mailing list and you very well may collect someone's name and email address to process their order. But with tech companies, you can very well be looking at different types of data, not just email address and the password they submit, but health records, things of that nature. And because tech touches every industry, the tech product that you manufacture for a health company is going to be used to service those requests. And if you're passing them through and you're holding the data for them in a cloud-based way, then you're the one responsible for it. Yeah.
All right. So what's interesting is that I think everyone up here, your companies handle data for other people, right? So you have, I think, a different set of requirements that you have to adhere to. So could you maybe briefly just talk about some of the things that you are doing or have done or plan to do as a result of GDPR, and then we can circle around to what this means for other companies and other folks that are building similar services.
So this actually doesn't probably today impact NodeSource directly, although we are working on some SaaS versions of our existing product offerings, at which point it certainly will. And we certainly have thought about that because we'll be essentially collecting data about customers' applications running out live in the field, which is sensitive, if not personal. And it really comes down to a lot of thinking from the engineering side, which is all I care about, if I'm honest, is that you have to really start adhering to engineering least access principles and thinking carefully about how to silo that customer data so that you can quickly identify that for customer X, all of their data exists in a set number of places that you know about that you can identify quickly and get to. Even if it's encrypted and you can't look at it, you need to know where it is. And someone said, delete all of it now. You have to be able to do that. So, engineering against those requirements and with that kind of mindset initially is basically where we're at in terms of thinking today.
Yeah. So for Twilio, because we're a cloud communication company, we're obviously touching and accessing a lot of personal data. You can think of it as phone calls. We know who called whom. In some cases, we record the audio of those phone calls if the customer's asked us to do that. We do the same for video. We have text messages that go back and forth. It may be as simple as, hey, your Uber has arrived, but it may also be that your prescription from a given pharmacy is ready or something else. So you consider that all that communication data is very personal and very private. So that's a big concern, certainly for us and for the customers that use us. So the biggest control we have in place is obviously your right to be forgotten, the ability to delete that data wherever it resides. We give you the ability to obviously use our service to send messages and calls, but we also give you historical access. We can store that data going back 7 years. And so being able to delete that data wherever it resides is the first key piece for us. The second piece is encryption of that data at rest, so to make sure that once it gets to our servers, it is always encrypted. Each customer has their own encryption key, so that if somebody were to breach one and get access to the data, that you couldn't then use that to decrypt anybody else's data. Hopefully that never happens anyway. Another is around audit controls. So our engineers basically end up being in what we call team-based access control, TBAC, so that effectively if you aren't on the messaging team, if you don't need access to that data, you can't get onto those servers. You can't see or get access to that data. And then when you do get access to that data, that we have audits of that as well. So we can tell you that this employee saw this record of this data on this date, or that if the data was deleted, who did that on whom's behalf, and having the ability to audit all of that. That's key sort of as the infrastructure for us. So if you could imagine a company where you didn't maybe start out that way, having to introduce all of that infrastructure is where most of our work fell to, and what we've been working on for the last year plus. And my job early on was to basically sit back and say, how do we actually do this? We have 120 some odd engineering teams. They're independent, work on their own backlogs. How do you kind of introduce a top-down orchestration effort for something like that? And that's what we've been working on.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So for Optimizely, it's been really interesting. So we luckily were able to sort of marshal the troops fairly early, but there was a lot of question about, okay, well, we know this law is coming. We know that we have, no choice, obviously, but to comply with it. But also, we want to comply with it. We, believe firmly that it's actually doing the right thing. But there is a question of like, okay, well, how much effort do we put into automating this work versus, doing something in a less automated fashion? How much are we going to get hit with requests for this? Like, how much do we know about what this is actually going to mean? We know this law is coming into effect, and we know it'll probably be tested early on. And we're also talking about other priorities, both operational, like, okay, well, how do we, we got to keep the lights on, and product, okay, we have to, be providing the features that our customers expect us to be providing. So we've kind of fallen on what I think is a fairly happy medium. We've definitely gone more towards automation than we were originally thinking we might have to, and I'm really happy that we did because I think it was the right thing.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit about what that automation is?
Yeah.
And what pieces are being automated?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So obviously, first of all, customers have to have a way to request, put in a GDPR request, right? Like, they have to notify us that they either, want that data to be deleted or want to see what we have on them. Where does that go? How does that process follow? Is there like a web form that you fill out, and what team does that go to? And then from that team, how do you get all the information from all the different places? We've of course gathered all the, had to gather all our, ourselves, like where things might be stored, any sub-processors, anything like that. And then you have to go, okay, well, so we have a couple, we might have like our core data store for our app that has like, sort of, account metadata. And then we also may have like our event infrastructure where, we have, giant HBase cluster that is, storing like click data and other information about, hey, like, did someone like this variation or this variation on an experiment? Because we're really all doing experiments. And then there's like personalization data, and those have differing levels of sort of PII associated with them, right? And under EU regulations, like what is personal is kind of different actually than what might be considered like, say, cardholder data under PCI or PII under HIPAA. So, we have to like know, okay, well, what of this is, going to this customer? Where are we storing all of these aspects of this customer? How do we scrape and find all of this? How do we ensure that it's deleted in time? Because you could run, say, a Hadoop job across the cluster and kind of find some of it, but you need to make sure you're finding all of it, and then you need to make sure that it's deleted, and then you need to make sure that it's actually deleted, because if you're familiar with Hadoop, you have to like, there's, you can tombstone your data, but you need to make sure it's actually gone, right? And that is all stuff that we had to consider, like, okay, how are we going to automate this? Or are we going to accept that we may be spending some of an engineer's time for the next few quarters while we're assessing, like, how much of a real inflow of requests is there and how serious is this, before we actually go and like, go whole hog on complete automation and have a nice big shiny red GDPR button that you just click.
All right, so before you start, our compliance officer, Kickbox is a little different because you exist to provide information on other people, right? So you probably had to do far more work here, but that's just a guess.
I'm exhausted. Um, yeah, so as a verification company, all of the data that we are collecting is always going to be on behalf of other people. So our customers are marketers and companies that want to cleanse their email list before they send out campaigns, and they utilize our platform to assess the status of each mailbox on the list before they send them out. So we can identify using a nice, what I call a magic technique, leveraging our network and the presence of emails on that network, as well as real-time SMTP request communication to ascertain the status of each mailbox. Is it deliverable, undeliverable, et cetera? And then we send them that data back in a spreadsheet. So they're going to upload a list of up to 1 million addresses per file, full of customer data, their customers. And as such, Kickbox is what's considered a processor of data. The controller would be our customers who are in charge of how the data gets processed. So yeah, it was a lot of data inventory in the beginning to determine where the data is stored. Some of that was incredibly easy. So for uploaded files, those are stored on Amazon. They're encrypted at rest and in transit. They're deleted after 90 days, so we sort of knew the scope. But for other things like the cache that we maintain and things of that nature, we had to really start thinking about where the data is stored, how long it's stored for, how can we possibly limit it. And then you get into the nitty-gritty of things like logs and things of that nature. Even your log data may contain information that's defined as by GDPR as personal data, and as well as the anti-fraud and abuse platforms. So because we have to protect our network assets, obviously you can't do SMTP communication if you get blacklisted by servers. We have to really monitor for abuse patterns and fraud and things of that nature. So we have some automated systems in place that upon visit to our website, they gather things like the IP address and a cookie identifier and an individual identifier and the device type and all of that stuff. And you might not think, as I'm saying that, you might think, well, that's not really personal information. That's not a name or an email address or a social security number. But under GDPR, personal data or personal information is actually identified, or is anything that is even partially identified to a natural-born person. So if it can be tied to even partially, so things like IP address, geolocation don't sound very ominous, but you actually have to protect that data just like you would their full social security number. So it's very tricky, and it's a lot of hard work. In the end, I think our approach was we were already collecting the data in a GDPR compliant way. We're very lucky that way because our CEO and founder is very privacy conscious. Our engineering team does secure coding from the get-go. There was a lot of interest in making sure that we're compliant with this. I was certainly not alone in those efforts. It's really an all-hands-in approach. So for us, I think at the end of the day, it was just about patching whatever holes existed, redesigning our systems to limit the data wherever possible, and then revamping our internal processes to match and be able to handle those GDPR-specific requests like data deletion requests or information requests. And I put the fear of God in them about audits, so that helped.
All right, so quick survey. How many people in here in the audience are working at a startup, meaning smallish company? Okay, so roughly half. For startups, what would you, Lance, maybe you want to start here. What would you recommend a startup do to start to prepare for this? Is it just as easy as saying, here's a button, you can download all your information or delete it? Or are there other things that startups should be doing?
Yeah, I was actually part of a webinar not too long ago that the same question was fielded. I think everyone wants to know the answer to this question. And so I think I can answer it depending on another question. When are you starting? Did you start 2 years ago, 6 months ago, 30 days ago, or are you asking right now? But either way, the answer is actually the same. Start. Start now. I'm kind of following Dennis's lead here. He recently got to go to a sort of gala event over in London and got to meet the EC commissioner and a lot of the DPA authorities that will be enforcing these policies that we like to talk about all the time. So it's not a violation to say, have permission to say that the DPAs at this point, and I'm sure a lot of you have probably already surmised this, are not going to be going after the companies that are putting things into place, all right? Now, I make no promises, this is not legal advice, but suffice to say that the DPAs have the authority to enforce those however they see fit, just like a judge might rule on a case, right? And if the judge loves your sob story about your ailing grandmother and that's why you were speeding, they might just not give you a ticket. The full fine, we hear the term 4% of annual revenue or 20,000 or these numbers quite a bit, or 20 million, I'm sorry, these numbers quite a bit, but the truth is it could be very small. It doesn't have to be the max fine. If you are egregiously abusing your data subject's trust, and if you are storing data insecurely in plain text, in a notepad, on your desktop, or what have you, then you're probably gonna get the hammer. But if you have systems in place, if you've made a full concentrated effort to make GDPR something you're working towards, then my advice is just start today. The second thing I can say is get a point person. Whether that's someone who works directly for your company or I'm available for consulting for a mere $30,000 an hour. No, seriously, get a point person because you want someone to lead this effort. You want to make it an all hands-in approach. As I said, you're going to need your engineers to tell your compliance people where they're storing the data. Your compliance people won't have a background or may not have a background like I didn't, and they won't know all of the places where it could be. So you're going to need your engineering team. You'll need the buy-in from your executive management team to devote time, resources, and sometimes even money towards the effort. And you'll need someone to put it all together for you. So I would advise start now. Dig into any resources out there. The DMA has wonderful resources to help prepare for GDPR. You can hit me up anytime, lance@kickbox.com, or help@kickbox.com, privacy@kickbox.com, compliance@kickbox.com. They all go to me, and Dennis. And of course, there's a lot of resources online that you can find for GDPR.
Okay, so do we have GDPR-related questions from the audience before we switch gears to site reliability? Any burning privacy-related questions? No? Everyone knows? Go for it.
So you asked about this in the context of a startup, like someone building a business. But what if you have like a side project? Like I give away a thing for free. Like how GDPR compliant do I have to be to to allow people to use my like toy application like all over the world? Like do I have to be?
So let me repeat the question. If you're building a side project, the question is, how GDPR compliant do you need to be?
I don't want to steal the stage, but I do want to answer this. GDPR touches every level, from the hobby project all the way to the multinational corporation. And I think everyone sort of has this burning inside them, whether they know it or not yet. So I guess my best answer would be you do have to be compliant if you're collecting European data. However, there are some special provisions for you in GDPR. There will be a couple of breaks that you'll get. And this actually goes for anyone who has less than 250 employees. So for startups that are relatively still small, you have some special breaks. So Article 30 requires, for example, that you have to keep very detailed records of processing, everything that you're doing, and you have to be prepared to answer in the event of an audit. But for those with 250 employees or less, you actually don't have to do that as much. You need to have a general disclosure of how you're collecting the information, but you do not have to keep like logs and logs. You won't have to hire a compliance person to fill out a bunch of forms and reports. You do need to have a privacy policy which discloses how you're going to be using the data, and it needs to follow the principles of GDPR for sure. So if you have access to any legal resources which could help you define that privacy policy, that would be your best step. You do have to still collect the information in a compliant way, meaning that the person signing up to provide their information to you has to give it with consent. It has to be for a specific process, and you have to be detailed about how you're going to use it. You can disclose that in your privacy policy, and then something as simple as a check mark on your website can suffice. It cannot be pre-checked. It must be an affirmative, intentional choice, so get rid of that. And then for the most part, like I said, again, not legal advice, but you will probably fly muchly under the radar, especially if you commit to deleting that data when requested and try to limit the data that you do collect and process. I think it'll be just fine.
Any other?
Yeah, I think I would just add one thing from purely the engineering side is if you've got a small project or a smaller startup or whatever, I'm going to make the assumption that from an infrastructure standpoint, you're using one of the cloud providers. I know more about AWS by a factor of like infinity than Azure or GCP or IBM or any others, but I can speak for AWS, and I mean, the whole point of using one is that they give you all this infrastructure with a click, and you can have servers and firewalls and load balancers and all manner of other things. But please be aware that, certainly Amazon, I suspect, certainly Google and probably Microsoft as well, at least, have an enormous amount of functionality that is also available that touches on these things. It's very easy to store things encrypted at rest if you're using Amazon. It's very easy to sort of set up audit logs of when things happen. And there's sort of less documentation and use cases, I would say, out there, compared to like, hey, here's how to set up your, load balancer, 2 web servers in a database, architecture. But they do exist, and there is a lot that you can leverage quickly and easily to keep data safe, understand where things are, understand who did what and when. So just be cognizant that if you're not learning how to use those things along with the sort of more typical cloud services that you think of, you're probably hurting yourself in this regard.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in on this? All right. Any other questions about GDPR?
Yeah, so if you're a service provider that's relying on somebody else for, let's say, analytics, and passing along data to them, what are your responsibilities in terms of, processing the requests to disclose data, delete data? Are you just responsible to kind of process, shove it along, or is there additional requirements on you?
So the question is, if you are essentially a customer of a third-party service that stores your data like an analytics tool, what is your responsibility as the user of the analytics service? Anyone want to answer this? I mean, this speaks to probably everyone up here in some level.
Yes, you're obligated both to indicate that you are using that service, to guarantee that they are handling the data in GDPR compliant fashion. What is their data retention policy? How are they handling data at rest? So just because you hand it off doesn't relieve you of the responsibility. You actually take on the responsibility. And if they can't be compliant, then you can't, in theory, use them and still be GDPR compliant yourself.
So the short answer is you need to know how these third-party providers are handling this data.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I'm sure, a lot of our companies actually are going to be kind of on the hook for is, we all kind of use each other as tools a lot of the time. And that's part of the motivator for making sure that we are all compliant, because otherwise someone's going to get left behind.
Yep. So Article 28, Paragraph 4 sets out the duties of what's called a sub-processor. So a sub-processor is someone that processes the data on the behalf of the person initially processing the data. So if I'm collecting the data for a Kickbox customer, but we use a file upload utility to get that file to us, then they're now a sub-processor. If I use Google Analytics to collect their IP address and stuff on the website for marketing, they're now a sub-processor. So not to scare anyone, but just because it's really relevant. GDPR actually mandates, sets forth that you're responsible for the data as if you were doing the processing. So once you hand it off, you're actually still completely and totally legally liable for the breach or misuse, neglect, or otherwise of that sub-processor. So if they do something egregiously bad, then your client has every right to sue you, and they will, and you can also be fined, of course, by the DPAs and the EU Council for that. So you definitely want to, honestly, like at Kickbox, we use a handful of sub-processors. A lot of our stuff is in-house. I can honestly say like the compliance with Article 28 was the hardest part of this process, because you have to reach out, you have to get a DPA, you have to work with their compliance teams, you have to conduct your own audit until you're satisfied that they're doing things the way that you want them to be done. Then you have to sign final contracts. The whole thing takes a long time, especially if they're dragging their feet. Some bigger companies that you'd expect to have those all together, let's just say, didn't have them together. We just completed this process like 4 days ago, and it was only because there was some delay in some of those companies getting their DPAs together. Yeah, so.
All right. Any more questions? GDPR.
Do you guys think that GDPR
So the question is, will GDPR give bigger tech companies an advantage over smaller ones, right?
I think it's the
Interesting.
reverse, personally.
I was
I think the
gonna
big
agree with you.
tech companies are in for a lot of trouble here, right? Both, it's hard to mobilize their workforce to get these things done. They often don't have access or even visibility into where all the data hides. I can tell sort of an anecdote. I was speaking with Autodesk about a year ago about their GDPR efforts, and they were mentioning that they had software that was written 37 years ago, stuff that was sitting in Access databases written in Pascal that no engineers even knew how to read anymore. So they were sort of struggling, like, how do I become compliant here, right? They had grabbed an email address from a marketing campaign 30 years ago that somebody now says, delete me. Where is it stored? So I think they're actually much worse off. The smaller companies are much better. Like, hey, I just have this one MongoDB where all my data lives. Like, great, you'll be compliant by the end of the month. Companies like Google and Facebook, where they maybe have huge HDFS clusters, where your record is sitting in the middle of a multi-terabyte file that they now have to pull a row out of, they're in for a lot of trouble.
That was pretty much exactly what I was going to say, but I think better said. So, yeah. Yeah, I would, if I was in a super small startup right now, I mean, I could probably be PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, everything compliant really easily from the get-go, because as you said, Amazon gives you all the tools for that. If you have accreted 30 years of tech stack, oh dear Lord, it's an archaeology dig.
Any other questions? I have one. So this is more of a basic question, but there have been regulations and there's all sorts of requirements in place now for, especially for fintech companies and anyone handling health data. So why is GDPR so different, and why is everyone so excited to comply with GDPR as opposed to everything else that's existed? It's almost as if nothing was there, and then now all of a sudden you have to do all this work to make data available and secure. Why do you think that is?
Cambridge Analytica. Yeah, so basically, all of these previous frameworks, so even the framework that GDPR is based on was considered insufficient and inadequate to protect in the way that GDPR will. So essentially, the previous framework was a suggestion. And so the member states, it was completely up to them how they would enforce that. It was not a law, sort of just a suggestion, right? So some member states wouldn't enforce it, some would enforce it in this way, others would enforce it in this really inadequate way, and there was absolutely nothing in between. So it was still common to get model clauses from your EU clients who would ask you to sign them, but they weren't actually mandated, so some of them would just not. The same thing is true with CASL, which is the legal framework, for Canada. I think we're going to see that GDPR, because it is an actual law, and because it's been adopted by the EU Commission, and it applies to all of the member states, and it's no longer optional, it really represents a radical departure of this sort of suggested privacy. Now it's mandated privacy. And I think that we'll see a lot of other types of regulations being informed by GDPR because it is so comprehensive. The language used is, in my opinion, very vague and broad, but I think it's meant to be that in its first iteration. I fully expect that after GDPR comes into full force and we start to see the implications of it and the applications of it, I think that the EU Commission will revise, and I think we'll start to see a lot of clarification coming out. And it will lead the way for further regulations, perhaps even for the United States, all of North America, and other countries as well. It's just different because it's so comprehensive. There's never been any legislation which has protected customer data in this way and has put the onus on the people processing it to really live up to these high standards.
All right. Great summary.
Yeah, and this is, again, that is, I think, policy-wise, very accurate. I would say from just an engineer standpoint, what's different is, if you take something like medical data, right? So say UCLA Health, I live in Los Angeles, gets hacked and somebody gets the list of prescriptions that I'm taking and I'm mad, so I now go sue UCLA, and they settle because that's what would happen. If you're UCLA in that situation, you fix the exploit that let them get hacked, like, oh, we were running outdated Tomcat, it was vulnerable. They fixed that. And then, and then there's probably insurance pays somebody somewhere, and then everybody just moves on. That's very different than a situation like this where without anything specific happening, if I'm an EU citizen, I can get in touch with somebody and be like, erase all of my data, right? You've got X days to do it. And from an engineering, engineering-wise, that is a vastly, vastly bigger and harder undertaking that requires, a lot of cross-departmental things in any company, which again is going to be much harder for a very big company than a small one. But you're going to have to understand. Just understanding where all of a person's data is can be very, very daunting, and then figuring out how to, in an automatic way, delete everything, ensure that it's deleted, and so on. And that has to be automated because you can't leave that process to human error, or it will eventually happen, and then you're even more liable. So technically, it's a much, much harder thing to bite off than defense against like a hack.
Got you. Okay, so the difference is that one is very sort of reactive, the other is sort of proactive, where you just need to be ready whenever.
Yeah, I would say very much. Like I said, again, the case that your personal identification today is exposed and something bad happens, and then you as an individual, worst case, right, there's a class action against a big company, it plays out, insurance money moves around, and then everybody moves on. Like, it doesn't necessarily require new process other than fix the vector that the attack happened through. But this, what we're talking about with the GDPR stuff, requires an enormous amount of new process. You have to track where everyone's data is at all time. You have to know where it is. You have to be able to get to it. That's really, because we store everything today, right? When I got into computers back in the day, like my first computer, I think, had a 25 meg hard drive. And today you can get a Raspberry Pi drive that's like smaller than your thumbnail that's 128 gigs. So, engineers these days, we're just like, store everything. Why not? It's free. And people do. Like I'm friends with a guy at Etsy who wrote the original StatsD thing, which we use all throughout the industry. They wrote that because internally they were like, we should be able to graph anything arbitrarily with like 2 lines of code for fun. Like that was their mindset, which is cool if you're an engineer and you want to make graphs, but
very cool.
Yeah, but not really cool if you need to like very carefully know where all of your data is at all time, because all of a sudden, some random thing that some engineer was like, I just kind of want to see this, and they start recording it and then forget to take it out, and then 5 years later you've been recording that for like everyone forever, and no one really knows. Like that happens. So yeah.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes left to talk about site reliability. So briefly, could everyone just talk about how you approach site reliability? And that can be from a team perspective or infrastructure, if you're infrastructure leaning. So yeah, let's just briefly go down the line and talk about how you ensure that your systems stay up.
Okay, so this is most of my actual job. But it's cool because that means I can give a concise, useful answer. No, I would say that the thing with site reliability really is that you just have to understand organizationally that site reliability is an engineering problem. You can treat it like other engineering problems. You can treat it like, it's not that unlike, add a new feature in some sense. It's a thing you have to decide, what you want to be reliable against. What you're like, do you have to be infinitely reliable? Can you have some downtime? If so, how much? You talk about like recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives in these terms, but fundamentally, you just have to decide like, what do you think could be a problem? And then you decide how much resiliency you're willing to spend engineering time to counter that, and then you test it. That's not terribly unlike, we want to add this new feature, how complicated is it? How long will it take to build it? It goes through QA. It's not crazy different. It's just that it hasn't traditionally been part of the engineering pipeline, I don't think. So, the term has now arisen because Google started making it part of their process to engineer for it, and then now the rest of the industry is doing it too.
Yeah, so we handle reliability in sort of an interesting way. We don't have a dedicated site reliability team. We don't have dedicated DevOps or QA teams. Those all fall to the product teams at Twilio. And so each team is responsible for the uptime of their service and anything technology they use underneath it, whether that's the databases or even AWS services. So one level is teaching the engineers how to spot architectural flaws, single points of failure, things that are dependencies and what happens when those dependencies fail. The secondary tier is to actually do testing to verify that when those things fail, the system behaves the way you would expect it to. And so we have some internal tools, a thing called OWL Chaos, that can basically introduce network failures and availability zone failures and instance failures. And so those are all useful tools to verify the data. And then obviously a lot of dashboards, things like end-to-end testers. We use Datadog a lot to have visibility into the systems and what's running and how they're doing. And the engineers basically drive to failure and then figure out at what point the systems fail and what is the next tier of each of those failures. So it really falls to the teams, which is probably unique for Twilio, I guess. Some companies are starting to do that as well. But that's how we think about site reliability.
All right.
Yeah, so yeah, it's the total ownership model that you described. That's actually something that I'm pretty familiar with. So prior to coming to Optimizely, I was at Heroku, which also did the total ownership model, and at Optimizely we do as well. I think it is absolutely the best way to handle operations is to make the people who write the code support the code, right? Like that's the best feedback loop. That's the virtuous cycle, right? Having been, in operations, network engineering, systems engineering for about 20 years, I would vastly rather have this. That said, I've definitely seen when you give a lot of autonomy to teams, you lose some support from the organization, and that is the tricky happy medium that I'm always trying to accomplish. So I think that it is helpful to have someone who's looking holistically at the health of your overall system. Like a complex distributed system has many different parts. It's easy for someone who's only looking at the health of one part to kind of miss some glaring issues in interactions between them. Incident response process should be like very multi-team and multidisciplinary. Incident retrospective should have really clear outcomes and action items, and they should be kind of driven from a higher level to make sure that like the most high priority things do happen and that it's not all entirely down to the team who owns the individual service, because no one really is alone, right? Like it's it's all one big system working together. So yeah, I think that service reliability it does need to be prioritized alongside all other sort of product work, as you mentioned, and you can definitely think about it that way. But it's almost like this is a sub project of every project. Like every single project has to you have to think about the reliability of the system. What's going to happen if any one component behaves in an unexpected manner, all the way from PRD, where the product people are kind of designing it, all the way through tech design docs, through feedback cycles, through engineering, then through figuring out how you want to test in both automated or even manual fashions. The goal is to get that as a part of the culture of your engineering organization, have ownership and transparency.
All right. Do you have anything?
I feel like I burned all my time on the GDPR stuff. I'll just keep it
Okay.
simple. So we also believe in the total ownership model. Every engineer is a site reliability engineer. We don't have a dedicated one. We use, just the typical tools like Nagios and CloudFront and Graphite, and I'm sure probably some others that I'm not even aware of yet, that don't contain logs that I needed to look at to find out where the data was stored. We don't have an on-call rotation, so all engineers are basically, all woken up, and they all kind of hang out in the engineering Slack and monitor those alerts and what have you. So that's pretty much how we do it.
Awesome. Well, I'll speak from the smaller startup side. We're 11 people, but every engineer deploys to production and is responsible if something bad happens. And I feel like today, for smaller companies and people that are starting out, it's just part of like how you do things. There's no separation anymore. You're just expected to be able to go end to end. But to speaking to the downside that you mentioned, Joy, there is this lack of general, someone becomes the point person, right? But they're not technically the point person. So you do have this shared responsibility, and you do have to deal with that at certain times, but it just feels like it's part of engineering now, right? So.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, I should point out NodeSource is not by any means a big company. I think we're about 50 people total, and I think maybe we're at 20 engineers. So we're also, I mean, there's basically only one team where everyone works on everything, so it's also still kind of total ownership. There are, myself and two of my colleagues are more infrastructure focused, so I think we get pulled into sanity check things, like, is this actually going to work? Like when we put it on real servers and not my laptop kind of questions. But that's just sort of an experience thing. The ownership model, I think, is given that cloud services exist and given sort of how agile teams work, and given that things are increasingly moving towards this microservice ideal, that the total ownership model it molds itself very well to the real world applications of these things. I would definitely just say though, test things breaking, because everything will break eventually. So.
Oh yeah.
All right, so we are officially out of time, but thank you everybody for participating, and we'll see you at the next Hot Stacks.